so others can.
Okay, I just started recording. So I think this is going to be the last cloud provider working group meetup for this year, right?
I believe so.
So one of the things that so Daniel just joined. It's great. So Jago and Walter, if you remember, Daniel joined us at KubeCon as well. He came and sat with us. He works at SAP, and he's going to help with the end-to-end tests.
Awesome. Thank you. Excellent. Thanks.
Hi, Andrew.
So I was also able to find someone else who wants to help with end-to-end tests. It's someone from Rancher Labs who wants to get involved in the Kubernetes community. I want to get some clarity on a few things about the end-to-end tests. And since Walter is here and also Jago is here, one, Walter is implementing it for GCE, if I understand, and Jago, you're talking to CNCF to get the machines for running the CI. Is that what's happening? I'm not entirely sure what's happening there. How do we see the end-to-end test working? Have we come to a consensus on that?
I don't think we have had enough conversation to call it consensus, but I think I think we're trending towards a reasonable direction. So how would I characterize that? Is that we met with the folks who are working on cross-cloud tests. I forget the name exactly. I think it's cross-cloud CI within that CNCF has contracted with to produce a tool for whose goal is essentially compatibility testing for various CNCF projects. And I think their scope and objectives are somewhat different than this group needs in the short term. And specifically, there are bits that I think cloud providers add in addition to core Kubernetes components that make it impossible for them to run continuous integration on behalf of the cloud providers. And so I think this has to be a process which is managed by each individual cloud provider to watch GitHub and either on a schedule or on every check-in or whatever works for that provider to run the conformance tests is my proposal. And as those get better over time, it will be a better signal. But I think it's a good starting point today, and it's not too many tests. And then post those results back to the endpoint, which eventually gets visualized into test grid.
Right. Okay. So
this is where Lucas's work on federated federation and that aspect comes into play.
Okay.
And what I believe is the right answer is a single dashboard in test grid, which has a row for each cloud provider and the last round of conformance tests. And we can ensure and have visibility into all the cloud providers are passing the conformance tests, or it broke one, or it broke all.
Got it.
I expect that will be the likely outcome.
Okay.
And then in certain cases, it will break all except for one that someone was working on. And so that's the general strategy. As far as working with CNCF to get the hardware, CNCF has worked to get some credits from Amazon, which I think Aaron Krickenberger has access to use those credits for a project like this. There is no global effort for CNCF to secure machines from everyone at this point, other than that cross-cloud provider or cross-cloud CI project.
Got it. Okay. So,
and I will write this up in the next couple of days and send it out to this group. It's been on my list. I just haven't gotten to it.
Thank you so much, Jago. Just a few questions to follow up on that. One is, do we have conformance tests for all the existing cloud providers, or does more work need to be done on that?
So the context on the conformance tests as they exist today. Conformance tests until recently were simply a label on an end-to-end test.
Okay.
And there was no process to add that label to any test.
Mm-hmm.
So they are inconsistently applied across the API surface, and they are woefully inadequate to assert that there's real consistency across providers of Kubernetes. So this is all well known. We focused first on the process to add new conformance tests. And now that exists, we're focused mostly on the workloads APIs, the portability of workloads first, and then we'll have a high-level prioritization of areas and ask SIGs to propose new conformance tests.
Mm-hmm.
And SIG architecture is the group that has to say yay or nay on each test.
Okay.
So no, we don't have conformance tests for each of the cloud providers. In fact, I think the conformance tests run without a cloud provider today,
mm-hmm.
as intended. And ultimately, the goal is that a Kubernetes installation on Raspberry Pi should be able to certify as a conformant Kubernetes API. So it shouldn't require cloud provider specific.
I see what you mean.
Or whatever.
I mean, I guess in the context of cloud providers, if we are simply testing cloud provider calls, like does it set the node labels correctly, or does it create a load balancer correctly, or does it provision and attach and detach volumes correctly? Wouldn't that require specialized tests for the clouds?
So I think a reasonable, I think in addition to the conformance test suite, I think a reasonable step for us to take is to add a new label to end-to-end test, which is cloud provider,
mm-hmm.
And exercises the cloud provider interface and ensures that those things are not only possible, but are handled consistently across cloud providers. Again, the goal here should be that as much of the code as possible is in the core Kubernetes binaries.
Mm-hmm.
And that will help us all ultimately, so we don't have to find a bug in one and then slowly over a series of quarters roll out a fix across different cloud providers. That's a world that I certainly don't want to live in, and I don't think anyone else would either.
I completely agree with you. So in terms of how we should move forward, I feel like how Daniel should move forward really.
I think the best first step would be to propose some of the existing E2E tests that are directly applicable to cloud provider functionality, and add a cloud provider label to that. And then we can all use that same label and expand the test suite that has that label.
Okay.
I think there will also be some work required to optionally run that part of the test suite.
Okay.
For example, if it's on bare metal or on the Raspberry Pi example, those tests will fail, and they are expected to fail. And so those tests would have the cloud provider label, but not the conformance label.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Should we start with changes to the kube test program in the test infra repository to get it to deploy a cloud with a cloud manager? Wouldn't it be the first step? Because I think at the moment we have the problem that we can't really run the end-to-end tests in the test infra without adapting it first.
Without adapting kube test?
Yeah. Or am I missing something here?
You may not be. I don't have great experience or insight into what is in kube test. My experience is just that kube test is a tool that will run end-to-end tests and takes command line arguments to figure out which ones to run. What more needs to happen there?
Daniel, are you asking if there's a different repository that you should look at, or is there a problem with running kubetest?
Sorry, seems like my internet connection just broke for a moment.
Did you hear my question? I was saying, was your question how to run kubetest, or were you asking if there's something else you should look at?
Yeah, so I think I just started to look into it, but I think that in order to run the end-to-end test somewhere, or in the test infrastructure, we would need to adapt the kubetest to be able to deploy a cloud with the cloud controller manager.
Oh, I see.
So I think that this would need to be the first step to get started. Because of course I could add end-to-end tests at the moment, but we couldn't really run them on the test infrastructure.
I understand. Yes.
I mean, we could deploy a cluster manually and run the end-to-end test just on them. But yeah.
So I think what you're getting in is into the build and deploy and the cluster lifecycle aspect of this domain. I think cloud providers typically have their own special ways to set up clusters in their own environments, and then end users use the cluster that has been deployed. So I think it would be sufficient, and the most immediate useful functionality to add would be to just write down steps. Here's the steps I took to install my cluster. And if you look at the conformance tests on the CNCF site, there is a requirement to document the steps taken to set up the cluster. If there are special command line arguments passed in or something like that. And so then a user will use the Sonobui tool from the FDO release to run the conformance tests. And it may be a good path to use that same tool in addition to the conformance test, to also run this cloud provider suite. And then at the end, use that tool and a plugin, I think they call them, to post results back to the test grid endpoint. And I think that's a process of creating a JSON document with the appropriate format and posting to an API that writes that JSON document to a GCS bucket. And then test grid can expose that. So some good folks to talk to on this would be Eric Feda and Lucas. And Lucas, I think in this document had dropped in a link to the federation tests about that part of posting a JSON document to the endpoint and getting the credentials right and so on. Is this helpful? Is this
Yeah, I think so. So I guess I will start them with a different path than I initially thought. I would just, as you suggested, add the first tests with the cloud provider tag. And worry about test infrastructure, etc. later on. And just work with the self-deployed cluster for the first development.
So I'm just dropping in the notes some steps that might be the right path. And it may be that I see the overlap in the conformance test just because I've been recently thinking about that. There may be another path, totally open to that. It's just this is the way.
I mean, yeah, Conformance test seems to make sense here.
Well, I also think, I mean, if you've got to devote all the people doing the refactor, AWS, etc., they have to do the work anyway. It seems like it makes more sense to make them do the work once than twice.
Correct. I agree.
Yeah. Is there anything else we wanted to go over?
I think from my perspective, getting this round trip, this whole process to work for even a single, like the conformance test suite plus even a single cloud provider related test, and getting that dashboard set up is the best starting point. And then we can incrementally add additional cloud provider end-to-end tests. I'm not as worried about adding new tests or adding a label to an existing test as I am at getting this process, iterating on the process a couple of times and seeing what we learn and what's difficult, and if this endpoint to post JSON documents to hangs for a minute. Like, I don't know any of that. So I think that would be the best use of time. Does that make sense?
Agree.
So,
yeah.
So Daniel, I think from my point of view, I would say look at the Sonobui tool. Look at some of the conformance test process and how to run the conformance test. Just try to leave the installation of the cluster itself to others. Like, this is an exercise for the operator.
Yeah.
Once you have that, just as if you were running the conformance test, pass in this additional flag, and it will run this other suite of tests, of which there's only one initially, and then focus on the output of that, format the JSON document and post it to the test grid endpoint. It's not really a test grid endpoint. I think it's just a GCS bucket that you write the JSON document to.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
And if you get stuck, I think Lucas and Eric Feda would be good points of contact to say, this is what I'm trying to do. Can you point in the right direction? And as with many things in the Kubernetes project, you can probably start a couple of different work streams because each will get blocked from time to time. Project tends to be hurry up and wait on a couple sides. Get something started and then you hit a blocker, and it's good to have a couple other projects that you can complete without being blocked. And that might be what to make the end-to-end tests themselves better, because I think you can do that without being blocked.
Yeah.
But for the scope of this project, I think the cluster configuration and installation should be outside the scope of what you take on. Both other groups are working on that, and it's too big and gnarly to expect that you'll be able to come up with the right way to do it for everyone.
Okay. Good.
Also, I want to discuss something about moving code from Kubernetes repository. Since we discussed last time that JGoal will be seen with CNCF, if we can have some repository to put code there. After a meeting with some folks from SIG Storage, basically what they're trying to do with the volume plugins is to write adapters, then give away the code to the vendors or cloud providers. So we might be syncing with them to see what we will be doing with volume plugins for cloud providers, because we're not basically, for now, I just started to work on the adapter for Google, and I don't know when I'll have an MVP, where should I put it, or just send a PR to the Kubernetes repository, then move it after, or just wait?
So I can give a quick update on that. For the cloud providers that are currently in Tree, they are grandfathered into whatever the previous agreement was, which is that it is owned and operated by CNCF. Caleb Miles here has the right permissions to create new repositories, so he's putting together a structure as a proposal for how to move that, and we can do that without much discussion, or it's not confusing from a legal perspective. It's not confusing from a project intention perspective. So for the existing code, I think we have a clear path forward, and they will either be new orgs or new repositories in the Kubernetes org. That part I'm not sure of yet, and Caleb is going to try and figure that out. At that point, we can move the code there. That will require some tooling and careful steps to make sure we don't break anything in the process. But I think from a ownership and legal perspective, that one is not terribly tricky. This is new code that is not currently in the Kubernetes repository, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so I think this new repository that contains the Google Cloud Provider code would be one reasonable place to put it. And that would be my hope, is that we can do that. I think the other for you is there's a Google Cloud Platform repository as well.
Yep.
That requires going through the Go releasing process and getting the sign off and all that. Although it may require that anyway. But our ultimate goal here is to have other repositories that is code owned by CNCF, but is de facto managed by other organizations primarily. And I think that's something that Microsoft needs and Google needs. I expect everyone needs something similar.
Because basically the new code will be a subset of the volume plugin that will be existing. So it will be an addition to a pre-existing code. So do we just host it there and wait?
Yes.
To move it out?
Yes, that would be my suggestion. Is if it's an extension or augmentation of code or intention that's already in the Kubernetes repository, work with that, and
we'll move it.
This issue is more broad than that specific issue. So I would say wait for it to be solved holistically rather than trying to.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, if we tried to move it out too early, we may end up introducing a dependency in the wrong direction. And so it's better to have it in tree and then move it out with everything else so we don't introduce a backward dependency.
Okay, sounds good to me.
All right. Did we have anything else to talk about today?
Two things quickly. One, so I've sent out the KEP proposal. So if people could take a look at that, that would be awesome.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is I sat down with the Node team, went over our plans with them, and I got pretty good feedback. Everyone seemed really happy with what we were doing.
Mm-hmm. So
the Node team seems pretty stoked with that. The one thing they did ask is that we make sure that the cloud provider team is happy with what we're going to do. So I sent a note to Lucas, and hopefully I will hear back shortly. But since he's one of the cloud you asked to check with the lifecycle team. Okay. So I sent a note to Lucas, and since he's one of the leads on the lifecycle team, I'll defer to his judgment on that one.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Is that it? Are we done? looks like it. So I wish all of you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
All right. Same to you all. Thanks, Sid.
Merry everything.
Merry
Take care.
See you all
Bye.
next year.
See you.
See you.